City is a unique community. This uniqueness is shaped by the people who contribute their ideas, their gifts, and their energy to the life of Iowa City and the university. Welcome to a series of biographical interviews of special women and men who've affected this community. Their contributions have been valuable, their lives creative and full. What brought them here? Who influenced them? What contributions are they the most pleased about? These and other questions will be explored during this series of interviews entitled Tell Me Your Story. Dr. Alson Braley is no stranger to Iowa Cityans. He has been involved over his long and distinguished career with both town and gown. Dr. Braley was head of the Department of Ophthalmology at the University of Iowa from 1950 to 1967. He performed the first corneal transplant in Iowa. He founded the Eye Bank and the Iowa Network. In his career, he trained over 100 ophthalmologists. Under Dr. Braley's leadership, the U of I department became an international center for eye treatment and research. And after leaving the university, Dr. Braley went into private practice at Mercy Hospital for 10 years. He has 3 children, 5 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild. He is an avid ham radio operator and loves the game of golf. Words used to describe him by his friends and colleagues are integrity, honesty, charisma, colorful, and openness. Your story begins in Lake Mills, Iowa, but you traveled around a lot when you were young because your father was a pharmacist. What made you decide to think about medicine, Dr. Braley?
Well, it wasn't until the 8th grade. I had an 8th grade teacher who was a fine lady, and she was the one who kind of told me that I should go into medicine. But of course my father didn't want me to go into medicine. He wanted me to take dentistry if I ever got through school, which I was hoping to come to the university.
So you came to the university and then decided that medicine, and you talked your father into it.
Yeah.
And but how did you go from medicine? How did you decide to specialize in eye?
Okay, that's kind of a long story because all the way through I was interested in urology, even when I was in high school, because I liked the ideas that were presented with urology, because it was a combination of the examination of the patient and taking care of the patients, and also with x-ray. Now, x-ray was reasonably new in those days, you see. This was in the 20s. And so I was interested in that. So I'm graduating from medical school in 1931. You had to take a rotating internship. And so I took the rotating internship, and part of the rotating internship was in urology. Well, I just couldn't stand it. Honestly, goodness, as far as I was concerned, it was terrible. Well, Phlox, of course, I thought that was awful for me to ever say that, but I used to say it. Anyway, in order not to take a residency in urology, which I'd kind of planned on, I went into pathology under Dr. Huntsman and Dr. H.B. Smith. So I took 2 years of pathology, and while I was in the pathology residency, it was a combination bacteriology and pathology residency, you see. So I did a postmortem on a boy that died with Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Well, nobody knew much about the disease at that time because it was due to rickettsia. And I didn't know anything about rickettsia, and neither did anybody else in the department then. So there was one man in the department, not in our department, but in the eye department, who was working on trachoma. And his name was Dr. Phillips Tygeson. And so I took my slides and my things over for him to look at, and he and I became staunch friends. So much so that he was the one who convinced me to come and take a residency in ophthalmology, for which I am absolutely delighted. I couldn't have done anything finer, even if I had fallen in, which it mostly was. Dr. O'Brien used to get so mad at me, but it's funny about that. But I can tell you, we had a great time. But I've got to tell you about a trip once Dr. Tygeson and I made down to Arizona. Now, the reason we went to Arizona was to study trachoma. And I think it's most interesting that we did this, but we didn't know how the trachoma virus grew, you see. And so I thought, well, so many of these Indians that have trachoma down there have lice, head lice, body lice. So I thought of a way. I started examining these lice that these because I knew about rickettsia, but their gastrointestinal tract, the lice gastrointestinal tract, have rickettsia. See, instead of, we have coli, B. coli, it's what it's called, and there's a new name for it now. But that everybody has to have bacteria in their intestinal tract, and so the loss. So I didn't ever find any trachoma in there. So I thought, well, I'll just plant trachoma in there. So I learned how to give lice enemas and wash out their gastrointestinal tract and put the trachoma virus in there. Well, that was really something. Everybody just howls when I tell them about that. But anyway, then I had to keep the lice alive because they have to eat some on blood. So I had to wear the lice on my leg in a capsule. That was a lot of fun. Then I came back up here. In the meantime, of course, the public health department bought us 10 monkeys. Well, coming back to Iowa with those 10 monkeys was more fun than a circus, but we made it. And I had my little boy with me, you see. We just had a new baby, and that was 1936. And now they asked me to come up to Detroit, Parker Heath. And this,
in 1938,
of course,
I think it was.
1938, that's right. And so we went up there in 1938
to work with this very famous
ophthalmologist. Very famous ophthalmologist.
And I heard he was a hard worker.
Hard worker. He would try and see as many as 100 patients a day. And he got mad at me because I could never see 60 patients a day. Can you imagine that? Really, when I think about it, I think I do well to see maybe as many as 10 or 12.
What a training ground for you. So after Detroit, you went to the Eye Institute of Presbyterian Hospital in New York City, and which was a part of Columbia.
That's right.
And then you went to chair in 1948 the department at New York University. Right. What was the pull that brought you back to Iowa in 1950, Dr. Braley?
Now, it isn't fair to ask me that.
Why?
Because I have corn coming out of every ear, you see.
Oh, you do?
Sure, absolutely. You can't get rid of the corn out of an Iowan. And I'm basically an Iowan. And if it hadn't been for Iowa, I could never have gone to college. And I tell you, because of so many things about it, so I came back, and then they called him up. Actually, I think it was, I might remember Dr. Saz, A.D. Saz, and Emery Warner were two members of the search committee for a new head of the eye department, you see. And so they came to New York City to see me. And so we went to an automat to have lunch. They took me to an automat to have lunch, which was like I liked it because, you know, an Iowan is not, they don't take you to the best places in the world. At least they may sometimes, but not often. So we had a wonderful time. We've often kidded about that. And so I said, well, as soon as I finish my year down here at NYU, I'll be back to Iowa. And that's where my, let's call it, this is where my home was, this is my life, and I wanted to give back to Iowa whatever I could.
It's wonderful. And you did. You have the honor of doing the first corneal transplant in Iowa.
That's right.
And that was about in 1955.
Oh, a little before that.
A little before that.
Because it's about 1953. 52 or 53.
And now they've done, Iowa's done over 3,000 transplants with an incredible success rate.
A very high success rate. Over 90%. Yeah, over 90%. Yeah.
I'm sure you've seen since 1953, 52, so many. What are the major changes in corneal transplant?
In the sutures, the suture material. This is the most important single thing. This is the suture material. I used to have to use silk. Now, silk is irritating. I don't suppose you know this, but it is. I don't know what is irritating in the silk, but now with the nylon sutures, it's not irritating. And Teflon and all the rest of the things, it's a very fine suture. And you can leave the sutures in for long periods of time, you see, in the cornea, which you need to do, because the cornea is not vascularized. There are no vessels there. And it must heal by scarring, by scarring of the collagen. And that's the way it has to heal. And you hope it heals clearly. I think I have a picture of one here on the back here, just for fun. You might show that picture here. Whoop, it's right here. Show the scar that occurs right there.
So the sutures have become just...
The most important single thing. The sutures are very, very, very important. I would say that the sutures are 95% of the success rate.
And I read
so
someplace they're so fine they're like a piece of hair.
That's smaller than a piece of hair. As a matter of fact, the suture is so fine that you have to look at it with a microscope. You can't see it otherwise. And if you hold the suture by the needle in a needle holder, the suture stands right straight out like that. It's so fine. It is just gorgeous.
It's pretty tough back there, wasn't it, in the 1950s, doing it with that heavy suture?
That's right, pretty tough. And of course, when I came out of the service, I was in the Navy. When I came out of the service and coming back in 1945, I said, I've got to find a new gimmick to do. Well, I happened to go in the same office with Dr. Castroviejo, who was probably one of the earliest corneal surgeons. And so that's where I learned to do corneal surgery.
Where was this?
This was in New York City.
In New York.
This was when I came back from the service. I was in the Navy for 3 years, you see, at the St. Albans, and came back to the Eye Institute at that time in New York City. And I shared office space with Dr. Castroviejo, who was the foremost corneal surgeon in the world at that time, in the world. And he was very kind and helped me a great deal. Used to refer me a few patients that needed to have it. So that's how I learned, also on rabbits. Go ahead.
Just to digress a minute, because you brought up about the Navy. You were at this hospital and you commuted, and there's a story that one of your persons in the car that you commuted was Dr. Spock.
Benjamin Spock, that's right. You see, I lived in Tenafly, New Jersey, and our Navy, where we were in the Navy, was out on Long Island at St. Albans, which is on the other side of Jamaica, if you know anything about it. Well, anyway, there were a group of us from New Jersey over there who were in the Navy, and so we tried to stay at home as much as we could. So we would meet at one of the bridges, usually at the Manhattan, at the Holland Tunnel, and park our cars. Then we'd all get into a car and drive out to St. Albans. And we used to pick up Benny Spock all the time.
Benny Spock is what you called him.
We called him Benny Spock. He was at that time writing the book. And we were helping him write the book. Yeah,
Did you all kind of input about child rearing?
We gave him lots of input on the book.
Good for you. Did you know it was going to be such a bestseller and make such an impact?
Never dreamed it was going to be such a bestseller. But we have so many stories about Benny. Benny was a great guy. Oh, he was one of the nicest guys you ever wanted to know. But my goodness, when I think about Benny and all of his problems he's had with, he was opinionated, if you know what I mean.
Right,
he had opinions, like I guess all the rest of us have, but some of his opinions were a little far out, as you can imagine. Benny did. Benny got into the trouble with the law a couple of times, as you know.
Right.
But I had a very, very nice letter from him not too long ago. He was down in the Virgin Islands, and he wrote me an awful nice letter. Can you imagine that?
That's wonderful.
Been years.
All these contacts from your commuting.
Yeah, that's right.
Now I'm going to jump back to Iowa, and we've talked about the corneal transplants that you did, the first ones, and where you learned to do that. You also have the honor also of beginning the Eye Bank and the Iowa Network.
Sure, that's right.
Tell people who, I'm sure most people know, but there might be some people who are new to Iowa.
And about 1960, we had started the Eye Bank Association of America. And I was getting most of my eyes, before that time, from Buffalo, before 1955, when we started our eye bank here and all that. But I had 1955, I kept working, and I got the Lions to help me start the eye bank, start the first eye bank. Well, it was just great, the way they helped me, but that in itself is a story. Now, in order to present my story to the Lions, they asked me to come up to Fort Dodge, where the state was having a convention, a state Lions convention. Well, I had never been to a Lions convention, and I was to talk at a breakfast meeting they had up there. So I had a cousin who lived in Manson, and I kind of wanted to go and see him anyway, and that's right next to Fort Dodge, so I went to Fort Dodge, and the next morning at 7 o'clock for the breakfast. Well, I was met at the door with guns going off and people shooting. They said, "You can't go in there, you're no good, you're not a Lion, you don't have enough things on," and all that kind of good stuff. And I said, "Okay, I'll turn around and go back." Well, yeah, you can't even go back because you have to pay a fine. See, I didn't have a ticket to the banquet either, you see, to the breakfast. And so forth. So I had a terrible time, I tell you that. But that was all in fun as far as they were concerned. They were just giving me the business. But anyway, I got in after somebody rescued me, you see.
Sure.
Well, I'm telling you, I was scared to death there for a few minutes. But I got in, presented my story, and by gosh, if the Lions, it's like trying to hang on to a lion's tail. You just have to keep up with them. But the Lions of Iowa have done so much for us in our department. It's just unbelievable what they did for me and our department. All because I got them started. Just think of that beautiful corneal center we have over there that the Lions built. And they gave me money to start a new part of the building, our glaucoma center that we had over there. It was part of that and partly from another amount of money that I was able to find and so forth. So it's been the greatest thing you can ever imagine what the Lions have done for us right after that little speech that I made.
I'm glad the two of you got together,
Yeah.
Dr. Braley and the Lions Club. Now, you know, when you hear eye bank,
Yeah.
you think that there are eyes lined up in a bank.
That's
I mean,
right.
that's your first initial
Yeah.
reaction, but it's truly just a clearinghouse,
Just a
isn't
clearinghouse, that's all. Just a clearinghouse. Well, to make it a kind of a different kind of story involved, in 1960, we'd been running about 5 years, and you don't have any eyes in the eye bank.
Right.
We'd think you should have, but you don't, because you use them as fast as they come in. You usually have about 20, 30 people on a waiting list to have corneal transplants. But you'd think we'd have plenty of eyes, but we don't. And it's still true to this day. So it is kind of a clearinghouse, as you say. So I tried to investigate this business of having a clearinghouse there by using teletype. You see, that every eye bank in the country would have a teletype. Well, unfortunately, this was terribly, terribly expensive at that time. So I said, well, a number of us are ham radio operators. And so I said, well, we'll see what we can do. And so I got a hold of Ted Hunter and several other fellows that I knew very well I knew. So, because I talked to them on the air, you know. And we said, well, let's see what we can do. So on December the 20th, 1962, we had our first eye network, ham radio operators on the air. We met on 3970, and we said, well, we need eyes in Iowa City. I had a patient that I couldn't find an eye for, and his only eye, it perforated. So this was a real emergency. Oh my, that was terrible. So I could not save this man's eye because I couldn't get an eye anyplace. Because this was before I started the eye emergency net. So your help started with Ted's help. And so, but on December the 22nd, there was a little girl in Oklahoma City that needed to have a transplant because she had a perforated cornea also. And there was an eye available in Chicago. And that was our first one that we were able to arrange for the transfer of the eye from Chicago to Oklahoma City. If you can imagine this, to save that little girl's sight. And 26 years later, I met that little girl. Can you imagine that down in Oklahoma City? That little girl who had had her corneal transplant 20 years before. Can you imagine that? Goodness sakes, it really was wonderful. It was the most real experience.
And you got to meet her.
Yeah.
You also the ham radio operator.
that's right.
Then you have the surgeon. Now you have, isn't the highway patrol in this
in there.
also?
The highway, we got the highway patrol and the airlines in, through Ozark Airlines, you know. But the highway patrol were wonderful. Oh my, you know, we have had the highway patrol would transport the eyes very nicely, did a beautiful job, just a beautiful job. And they would bring them, they still bring them, even to this day. They bring them from all the outlying areas. We have people, you see, and that's another part of the story, because the retrieval rate is not as good as you'd like to have it, because you don't get the eyes of people that have signed up sometimes, because they bury them before you can get the eyes, or they embalm them, either one. So lots of times you wonder why you don't get them. So the first thing I did was with another Mr. Strube, Clarence Strube, and I. Clarence Strube was the he was the embalmer for the Department of Anatomy, and of course over here. So I said to Clarence, let's try and train funeral directors. So Clarence and I got busy, and now Clarence sent out a letter to the funeral directors asking about that, and unfortunately all of them were negative that he wrote the letters to, and which was a mistake. Well, so we had to wait another year before we had our first course on training funeral directors to remove eyes, and it's been the most successful thing all over the country, really, and it's been.
And it was started here in the state.
Started right here in Iowa City.
Iowa City.
And we used to have these funeral directors who'd come in, and Clarence and I would teach them how to take care of it, what to do with the body after the eyes had been removed, and all of these things, which the funeral directors, many of them, didn't know what to do, see, which was very unfortunate. So we had so many courses here, but not only that, but everybody else in the country. They have courses now in Baltimore and in New Orleans and in San Francisco, the courses training funeral directors, which is absolutely wonderful as far as I'm concerned. The contribution, that little contribution that we made.
I do want to ask a few more questions, Dr. Braley, before our time is up.
Yeah.
You were able to attract, as chair of the department over so many years, incredible, talented physicians to come here. How did you sell Iowa to these physicians from around around the world, too, who came here to chair the department or be in the department?
Well, I think it's partly, I have a different philosophy about people. I think every person is an individual, has his known drives, has his own abilities, and should be able to show them. Now, when I came here, Dr. Leinfelder was here, and Dr. Walker, and we had 6 residents, but by the time I got here, there were only 4 residents. I was so disappointed, you see, because it had been such a good program and had been allowed to deteriorate. The first thing I had to do was to go and get residents and get staff. See, I had to get staff. And so the first one, I knew that Dr. Burian was unhappy because he was in private practice in Dartmouth, at Hanover, you know. But he was in Hanover, you know, up there. Well, he was unhappy, and he'd been in Boston because he didn't have a chance nor the time to do any of the kind of research that he wanted to do. So I approached him about coming out here, and but he never dreamed of it. And so after we presented the story to him, and that he'd be his own boss and all the essentials, really, except, of course, I'd do everything I could to make it as pleasant as possible for him, and he came. And then I heard that Dr. Blody, and that, of course, is another story. Dr. Blody's story is one of the most interesting stories, how I ever met Dr. Blody, because he came to the Eye Institute. He was a war bride, you know, Dr. Blody was. And so he came to the Eye Institute to work. because he was from Vienna, and his wife had brought him over here. You see, they'd gotten married over in Vienna, and he, of course, came in, and his name being Blody and my name being Braley, we had lockers together. And so I never met a stranger. You don't know this, but I never met a stranger. So I visited with him the minute he walked in with his overshoes on. They are off, one of the two, because we carried him into the Eye Institute, because that was Taj Mahal. So anyway, here's Dr. Blody. And so I heard that Dr. Blody was interested in leaving New York. He was talking about going to Cincinnati. I immediately called him up, and his wife said, absolutely no. She was in the wax out in Des Moines, and she'd never come back to Iowa. So I had to bring him back here, presented my story to them, and so forth, and darned if they didn't move here. What a pleasure. Oh, gosh. And then I met a guy by the name of Watsky, Dr. Watsky. He was in private practice in Los Angeles and fed up with it in a way. I suppose you have to say that. And so I said to him, would you like to do work here? And he grabbed at that, and he was delighted. But of course, that's another long story. But I have one more story to tell you about. That is about Dr. Paul Boder. Now, Dr. Paul Boder was one of the big shots in American Optical Company. Well, the president of the American Optical Company had been a friend of mine. I'd known him in New York because we had some common things in New York. So they lived up in Southbridge up there. So one time I made a trip up to Southbridge to see some of the things that American Optical Company were doing up there, and met Paul Boder. Well, Paul, of course, being a mathematician that he was interested in doing research. So I suggested to the then president of American Optical that I thought it was time that some of the companies like that plowed back something into education. And I said, why can't you pay Paul his salary and let him work in our department where he can work with people doing research and things like that, rather than working with people who do mostly the business of optics, you see. And I said, let him do the work here. And so after a period of time, they said, yes, we'll be glad to pay his salary and also keep up on his retirement program. So then I had to sell it to the university. So I went to the dean's office. Can't be done. Can't be done. Well, Mr. Hancher was I feel so badly about that article in the paper about his being a poor president. Oh, it just breaks my heart. Well, I went to see Mr. Hancher. I presented the whole thing to him. He says, I think we can do it. We can bring him here and have him paid by the American Optical Company. That's fine. That's great. So that we did. And Paul came, and what an addition he was. He did so many wonderful things for our department and so forth. And I think, so that made a real fine staff with Leinfelder and Burian and Fred Blody and Bob Watsky, and then all the fellows that came that they attracted and I attracted. It was really a wonderful staff that we had. And of course now it's even blossomed even more.
And I heard tell that one of the things how you sold Iowa was because of you and your charisma, Dr. Braley. You're too modest. You're a grandfather.
Yes.
Your father, you have 3 children, right?
Yes.
Scattered throughout the United States.
That's right.
And 5 grandchildren and a great-grandchild.
Yeah.
And do you still golf?
No, I don't golf anymore.
You don't
Not
golf.
Since I had all this trouble.
But you're still on the ham radio, aren't you?
All the time.
And you retired, you went into, after you left the university, you went into private practice at Mercy Hospital for 10 years.
For 10 years.
And at 1970, when you were 70, you retired.
When I was 70, I retired. Now, the reason I retired is because I said I don't want to make any mistakes. I had seen Dr. Heath, who was not quite 70, make so many serious errors. Oh, I tell you, this made me sick, you know, to spoil an eye. Oh my, that was awful. I said, I don't ever want to spoil an eye.
And you never
And
did.
I didn't.
And you retired at...
And I retired before I did. Thank the good Lord I did.
But you really didn't retire. You golfed a lot.
I
and
did.
Every day you talked to your ham radio
I should
friends.
say so. I didn't really retire, and then I got interested in the computers. I'm into computers. And in the meantime, of course, I got several holes in one. I shot my age
Congratulations.
several times out on Finkbine.
And I've heard tell also that you go on these, you get into your van and
Yeah.
go on your long trips
Well,
down
I do
to Florida.
since I had this trouble. I need oxygen all the time, which is unfortunate, but I'm glad I have the oxygen. If I didn't have the oxygen, I wouldn't be here. See, I would have to be settled. So in order so I can go places, I bought a little Winnebago. It's called a Lacharo. And it's one of the small ones, only 19 feet long, but it runs just like $1 million. I've had more fun than you could ever dream of with that thing. Now I'm going to leave Sunday to go to Sterling, New Jersey, which is out in New Jersey, and I'm going to see my great-granddaughter. I have never seen her. She's over 2 years old now, and I'll have a chance to see my oldest boy and his wife and family. And then come Thanksgiving, I'm going to go down to Dallas, Texas, where my younger boy lives. But this summer, I went out to Jackson, Wyoming in my motorhome and stayed 3 places on the way out there to Jackson, because it's kind of nice to stop early and do your own cooking and have a wonderful, wonderful time and go to bed when you want to go to bed. People say to me, why don't you take somebody with you? I said, well, if I took somebody with me, if they're young, they'd boss me around. If they're older than I was, I'd have to take care of them. So this way, I can only get along this way.
That's a great story. Oh, Dr. Braley, we really need a couple hours for all of your stories, and you've had a wonderful, wonderful life with so many interests, and when you retired, you truly didn't retire because you've taken up computers, and your ham radio, I know, is an important part of your life. And I appreciate you coming and being my guest on Tell Me Your Story. My guest on Tell Me Your Story has been Dr. Alson Braley. He was chairman of the University of Iowa's Department of Ophthalmology for 17 years, trained over 100 physicians, performed the first corneal transplant in Iowa, founded the Eye Bank, the Iowa Network, worked in private practice for 10 years in Iowa City, helped raise 3 children, and has made a difference to countless friends and colleagues. He's a man of spirit and integrity. The community and the university are indeed fortunate that Dr. Braley chose Iowa City to be his home.